You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, recording from Washington, D.C.
And I'm your co-host, Katie Putz, recording this time from Maine.
Yeah, well, good to have you back, Katie, for our first discussion in 2022. I think our listeners probably won't be too surprised to hear that we will be devoting this episode to the concerning and tragic events in Kazakhstan, which kicked off on just the day after New Year's Day. I won't be talking too much because Katie is the expert on Central Asia and Kazakhstan, but I certainly have a lot of questions about the origins of the unrest in Kazakhstan, the response by the government, the involvement of the CSTO, the geopolitical ramifications for Central Asia. So there's a lot to cover here, Katie. But just to, give our listeners a little bit of a sense of the severity. We've had more than a week now of unrest. More than 160 people have been killed. More than 8,000 detained. Those numbers may still be a little fuzzy, of course, and things are rapidly changing as we record this. And I will just note that we are recording this on Monday, January 10th, as events are still quickly changing. But Katie, before we kick off a discussion on the broader the state of play now and the consequences, can you just explain to us, what was the origin of this, and what was the primary cause, in your view, of the original unrest in Kazakhstan?
So the what's happening now really started, so the proximate events are a series of protests in Western Kazakhstan on January 2nd. Now, the root of those protests was an increase in gas prices and the kind of gas that's used in cars in that section of Kazakhstan more than doubled between New Year's Day and the second day of January. And so in response to really that massive leap in prices, people came out to the streets in Western Kazakhstan. And then in the sort of ensuing 2 days, protests emerged in pretty much every major city in Kazakhstan. Initially in solidarity with the protesters in the western region of Kazakhstan. And maybe for our listeners who might be a little less familiar with Kazakhstan, the Kazakh government has made a lot of money on oil and gas extraction. It's the major industry in the country. And most of that work is done in Western Kazakhstan. But a lot of the communities in Western Kazakhstan have not seen significant development. And so there's a disconnect between the, wealth of the elites in Kazakhstan and the oil companies, and then what oil workers experience. I think it's worth mentioning that Western Kazakhstan is also where a decade ago, in 2011, there was a long-running oil strike. It was 7 months in, and on Independence Day in 2011, the authorities cracked down on that protest. That was the last sort of time that Kazakh authorities fired on protesters. And so the fact that this started in Western Kazakhstan is not surprising. Events quickly unfolded from there, and we'll get more into that. Most of the attention right now has been on Almaty, which until 1997 was the Kazakh capital. It is currently the largest city in the country. It's a financial center. It's definitely a power center. But that's where really the protests kind of went off the rails. And I say that in a very general sense because there were, as we like to call them, peaceful protesters, lots of them. And then something happened, and there are various versions of what happened on the 5th into the 6th. But by the 6th, several government buildings in Almaty had been burned. There were burning cars. There was gunfire. And then it's also worth mentioning that throughout this period in Kazakhstan, the government shut off the internet. So we still don't have consistent access to people in Almaty, for example. The last I heard, the internet's been on for a couple of hours in the morning Kazakh time, but then is off basically by the time it's daytime in the West. And so that really, really complicates getting anything other than the government version of what's happening.
Yeah, so that's a good place to actually, I think, reflect, which is the level of visibility we have into events more generally. You mentioned the internet crackdown, which is pretty much a tried and tested, part of the playbook for authoritarian leaders to respond to these kinds of events in their countries around the world. But Tell us a little bit more about, I mean, the sources of information for the outside world. Obviously, we have the government's version of events, particularly with the CSTO getting involved and sort of how they had to come up with a narrative to enable that, which we can get to in a minute. But how do we actually know the severity of this? Who's been, what's been perpetrated against peaceful protesters and so forth?
So there are, despite years of pressure, there are independent media in Kazakhstan. There have been a number of foreign journalists who have been based in Kazakhstan a long time. Not all of them were there when everything broke out, and some of them, such as Joanna Lillis, who writes for EurasiaNet and The Economist, haven't been allowed back into the country, despite having accreditation and residency there for more than a decade. So what we know that doesn't come from the government necessarily comes in these small windows of time that the internet has been active. And a lot of it has come out in connection to Kazakhs who live outside of the country. The diaspora is obviously shocked as the rest of us, but has a very deep emotional connection. And so is trying to reach their family. And so once people talk to their people, so a lot of what we have is anecdotes. And that's what we have right now. Hopefully we'll get more information. My hope is that they'll start letting journalists back in, and there can be some more reporting on what's actually been experienced. But I think if you watch protests pretty much everywhere, there's this period of absolute chaos and understanding. And it's hard to identify who a mob belongs to or what it is that they want. And there are just different levels of what's going on. I think there were peaceful protesters. Obviously, there's some evidence of an elite power struggle, which played out in various ways, including reports of the police kind of disappearing in Almaty for part of the night. A lot, and sort of pulling back from buildings, kind of allowing people to ransack them. And so people will construct narratives around these disparate anecdotes, and I can certainly do that. But I want to sort of hedge everything with, we don't really know yet.
Yeah, I mean, on the elite power struggle, I think if I'm not mistaken, Katie, I think the last time you and I had a discussion on this podcast about Kazakhstan in some detail was when Nazarbayev, sort of stepped down, became leader for life. Tokayev took over, and at least some of what I've been reading is that opportunistically or perhaps in a premeditated way, the two factions, to simplify, Tokayev faction and Nazarbayev faction, have been sort of duking it out behind the scenes. What can you say about that?
So that's definitely one aspect that certainly I think has some merits to it, in the sense that one of the things that Tokayev did amidst the protests was he dismissed the entire government, which is not actually that big of a move in Kazakhstan. It's sort of dismissing the prime minister and the ministers, and this happens every time there's something dramatic. But he also said Nazarbayev is not in charge of the National Security Committee anymore. And that was a position that when Nazarbayev resigned in 2019, he was supposed to hold on to for life. So replacing him and in that position was significant. And that was quickly followed up by initially the firing of the security chief, the successor organization to the KGB in Kazakhstan, which is a combination security intelligence, domestic organization that has very nefarious undertones. And a guy named Karim Masimov had been leading that since 2016. He had previously been prime minister of Kazakhstan. He was fired and then the next day arrested on treason charges, but that wasn't reported publicly until the 8th. So there were a couple of days where, and you can start to kind of piece together a narrative that, there were these organic protests separately. And then under that, in Almaty, where a lot of businesses are owned by Nazarbayev associates, there's a lot of talk about how much power and control the Nazarbayev family and the sort of network of brothers-in-law and sort of the family network has. And then you have the firing and arrest of the security chief. These things point to there being some kind of internal struggle. And how and why, we don't know yet. But I think as we move forward in time, some of the things to look out for is, what happens to the businesses that Nazarbayev's family are connected to in Almaty? Are there different people put in charge of security agencies that are not as connected to Nazarbayev. And it's also worth noting that Tokayev has not made any negative public statements about Nazarbayev. So it hasn't been blamed on Nazarbayev, but there's definitely a sentiment that there's some kind of conflict in the elite that played out either within or under the umbrella of this other sort of chaotic moment.
Right. So it's sort of, I guess this is something we'll get clarity on down the line. It could be a part of just broader power consolidation as Kazakhstan sort of fully settles into the post-Nazarbayev era.
And I think it's important to note that, Nazarbayev was president of Kazakhstan for 30 years. So there's a large network of people who worked for and with him. Maybe they didn't like the new guy as much. And Tokayev has complained over the last 3 years of sort of unnamed elements within the government that were stymieing his reform efforts. Now, right. Whether we can take those comments at face value is really hard to judge. But it is worth saying that, whenever there's a change in power in an autocratic state, there are losers. And if you were not on the winner side, then it's entirely possible that people took advantage of what was a chaotic situation on top of just sort of the normal chaos of protests.
So, taking a look at the neighborhood and sort of the external response to this, I think, we'll have to talk about the CSTO's reaction and response, because the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which includes Russia, Armenia, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan, on Tokayev's request, decided to intervene to stop what was framed as a foreign-supported protest movement in the country. And for that matter, which the Kazakh government also described as including terrorists. So what did you make of that? I mean, what is to be said about the CSTO's role here? How long are they going to stay in Kazakhstan? What are they doing?
So this is the first time that the CSTO has ever deployed. They have members of the CSTO over the last, 2 decades have requested intervention by the CSTO. The CSTO has always declined. This included both Kyrgyz revolutions and most recently the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh. Armenia requested support. The CSTO declined. And then most recently within Central Asia, when Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan were having a flare-up in their conflict over their mutual border, and there were, the Kyrgyz military and the Tajik military were firing at each other over border towns. The CSTO also said, not getting involved. And so the fact that the CSTO did send, I think the number is around 4,000, quote unquote peacekeepers, because that's the word that they use. People can argue over the semantics of that, but that's the word that they use. The fact that they actually deployed to Kazakhstan for this is remarkable, and I think does signal a statement, at least on the part of the CSTO, which is a Russian-led organization, and Russia holds sort of inordinate power within that organization. And that's visible in the numbers. I think the Russian troop contingent is like 3,000, and the other countries each are providing between 100 and 200. So it's this is, I think, and can be read in part as a statement on the part of Russia that, that it will get involved, if there's a revolution. And this is also reflected in the Russian government. Vladimir Putin, in his statement at the extraordinary session of the CSTO today on the 10th, used the phrase color revolution. It's not something the Kazakh government has called this, but it is something that's familiar to people in the post-Soviet space as a big, scary thing, and a pretext for involvement. And so the concern, I think, on the part of many in Central Asia is that now this kind of gives license to the CSTO to get involved when Russia decides that it should.
Right.
And I think it is worth, I'm just going to reflect for a second on the fact that the Kyrgyz government experienced some protests against sending a contingent to join the CSTO mission, put it before the parliament. The parliament voted in favor, so they did send, I think, 200, 150 troops. And the reading of that by a lot of Kyrgyz analysts was the Kyrgyz president, who himself came to power on the back of protests, kind of buying himself some insurance that if he faces some kind of internal threat,
Right.
that now maybe the CSTO will owe him and they will actually come and support him in a way they didn't support previous Kyrgyz leaders who reached out for that support. So
Yeah.
I think it certainly changes the dynamic of whether Russia would get involved in these states.
Right.
And the CSTO is the vehicle, but it's Russian involvement.
Yeah, no, I mean the precedent-setting effect here, I think, is quite interesting because this is the first time that they've done this, so I think this is going to set the benchmark for future CSTO involvement in the internal affairs. Right? I mean, we could even think back to events in Belarus not that long ago, and so how this affects the CSTO's role, I guess, among its member states, especially, is something that I find to be quite interesting. And then, just apart from the CSTO response, which is certainly the most significant external response to events in Kazakhstan so far, what are the other reactions from around the world so far to events in Kazakhstan?
So the Western reaction has been, I would say, extremely muted. Just general statements of, we want peace and stability and everything to kind of go back to where it was. The regional reactions have also been kind of muted. The Kazakh government is framing this as a foreign trained terrorist sleeper cell force. It reads like a bad global war on terror movie plot, I'll be honest. But within that, they're sort of de facto accusing the neighbors of sending terrorists to their own country. One particularly egregious example of this is a Kyrgyz guy was shown on Kazakh state television. He looked pretty roughed up, had a black eye, confessing to having taken $200 to fly to Almaty to take part in protests. And this is a pretty standard, forced confession of a paid protester. Except that he was recognized by Kyrgyz as a fairly famous, in Kyrgyzstan at least, musician. He's a jazz pianist who often goes to Almaty to play shows. And he was released today after state media then tried to say, that's not that guy. It's not Vikram. It's this other guy. And then they let him go because it was clear he was not who they were accusing him of being. But if that happens in one case, we have to think about these other 8,000 people who have been arrested. How much does the state actually know about their individual involvement? And that kind of becomes a rabbit hole of, can you trust any of this? And so the Kyrgyz government in this specific case has, walked a fine line, has said, obviously we want our citizens released, but they haven't necessarily been overly critical of the Kazakh government. We haven't heard critical comments from the rest of Central Asia either. So I have to think that Uzbekistan feels pretty happy that it's not in the CSTO anymore.
Yeah.
Because while the CSTO forces in Kazakhstan currently are, from what I know, guarding infrastructure, they're not pursuing they're not really engaged in extremely active missions or anything like that, though we don't really know. I think one can think through the domino effect of, say, a Tajik soldier got shot in Almaty. What's the response in Tajikistan to that? And that's one of those what ifs that hopefully don't play out. But that's when you intervene in another country and there's a civil conflict ongoing, those are the things that could happen.
Yeah.
I
realize,
do want to.
Yeah, go ahead.
I do want to just say that it seems that things have settled down. The last time I heard from folks in Almaty, there's less sounds of shooting in the street and things like that. The government says that they have a handle on the situation, but we don't quite know what happens next.
Yeah. I mean, before we get to what you'll be looking for in the coming days, one question that comes to my mind is, has the Shanghai Cooperation Organization had any statement on this? I mean, I know they claim not to interfere in the internal affairs of their members, but, given that the narrative here is terrorism, which is something that the SCO does focus on, I've been very curious.
I don't remember exactly what the statement was, but the Chinese authorities have commented on this. I think they also used the color revolution rhetoric, so they're supportive of the CSTO intervention. But one has to think that Beijing didn't want to necessarily get involved physically, though they certainly are lending moral support to the government's narrative that this is a terrorist incident, and that's all she wrote.
Mm-hmm. And so, looking forward, Katie, obviously a lot is still in flux, a lot of uncertainty still around this. So, we're now on January 10th. Coming weeks and days, what are you going to be watching for in Kazakhstan, particularly in terms of signs that things are stabilizing?
So the next big thing to look for is the appointment of the new government. So we will see if there are new faces, maybe, or if there's previous government shuffles have always kind of, the old government goes away and then it kind of comes back in a slightly readjusted, but the same set of faces. We'll see what the new government looks like. And I think that will help possibly explain where the elite chips have fallen. Similarly, I think in Almaty, there will be Kazakh journalists who are looking for major businesses and business people who are related to the Nazarbayevs. If they, was it their like which shops got burned? I think somebody's going to have to look through like what stores got burned and is there any kind of systematic choosing of them, or was it actually random violence? So figuring out who comes out burned and who comes out not, I think is worth looking for. I think the third thing would be the CSTO deployment. The Kazakh authorities say it's only going to be there a week. The Russian authorities have said something along the lines of until we don't need to be there anymore. So there's a gap between those two. I mean, I imagine it will be closer to that week because I think the precedent is set. There doesn't seem to be a need for some kind of long-term occupation. And 4,000 soldiers for a country the physical size of Kazakhstan is really not a lot. Even if you throw them all into Almaty is a city of like 1.8 million people. So, it's a drop in the bucket in terms of an actual security presence. But
Right.
Watching when that deployment ends or doesn't end, I think will be. And the last thing, where Nazarbayev is. So he has not appeared publicly since, I think, late December. So it's unclear. A Nazarbayev spokesperson said that he's in the capital and he, everybody should rally around Tokayev, but he himself has not appeared and has not spoken. So watching where the Nazarbayevs end up is important. They have a lot of really nice houses in London and Geneva, so they can leave the country if they want to, I guess.
And the state of emergency is supposed to expire on the 19th.
Yes. So, well, we shall see if I imagine that will actually end on the 19th as planned, unless there's further unrest. And then I think overarching kind of the last comment I want to say that I'm watching is how the government actually or does not attempt to address the concerns that started all of this. The government has said we've addressed the protesters' concerns. We put the cap back on gas prices. It's done. Like all the other chaos is because of terrorists. There's no legitimate concerns anymore. But that's not reality. Kazakhs are frustrated with inequality, with income inequality in particular in Kazakhstan. They're frustrated with the same kinds of things people around the world are frustrated with. The pandemic has not been nice to the Kazakh economy, just like it's not been nice to most economies. And so how the government deals with the socioeconomic issues that are at the root of actual public grievance is the most important thing, because if that's not settled, then nothing will be settled.
All right. Well, Katie, thanks a lot for sharing these tremendous insights. I mean, I certainly learned a lot, and we'll keep a close eye on this. Certainly, kicking off 2022 with a podcast on Central Asia was not what I expected. But
it's definitely not in my plan either. But
yeah. Well, thanks for taking some time away from your break in Maine to talk through these events. We'll look forward to the next episode with you when you're back in DC. So thanks a lot.
Absolutely. I'll talk to you soon.